so many people say maple syrup, $60 a gallon. What's up with that? But then as soon as you go out and make it and you know how the work that goes into it, and somebody had to tap that tree, somebody had to wait for that tree to drop the sap into the bucket, somebody had to carry that bucket back to an evaporator. It gives you a newfound appreciation of what's going on around you. And I think that's what we need in today's world, because like you said, you can go buy Log Cabin or any of the other brands out there that are just essentially corn syrup coloring and flavoring. And one, it's not healthy, but two, it's taking the skill out of maple syrup and taking these people that are what I would consider craftsmen, not even myself. I'm not even that good at it, but it's taking the craftsmen and the work and the knowledge that a lot of people possess. And it's essentially putting it back on the shelf and saying, I'll take this one instead for half the price, which could be made in a factory by a robot. It's, you're preserving that knowledge and preserving that technique for other generations to come.
This is the Homestead Journey Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the pursuit of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. This is episode number 119 of the Homestead Journey Podcast. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Wells. I am coming to you from 3B Farm and Homestead here in beautiful upstate New York. Now, in today's episode, I am joined by Jack Pollner from the Mindful Homestead. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time at all, you will recognize that name. And I believe he is my most frequent guest to date on the show. And so very excited to talk to him about homestead scale maple production. But before we do that, this week, folks, things have started to ramp up here on the homestead. A lot of things to cover in the Homestead Happening segment. So let's jump on over there and I'll bring you up to speed. So this week I did, well, it's kind of one of those rites of spring, and that is I ordered our chicks. Now, as I mentioned last week, I did not order my chicks through my local farm store like I have in the past. And if you want to know the reasons why, and you didn't catch last week's episode, go ahead and listen to that. On that episode, I explain exactly the reason why I have changed my tactics a little bit this year. But we went ahead and ordered from Hoover Hatchery again. That's where I've ordered probably the last 3 or 4 times that I've ordered direct from a hatchery. I've had great luck with them. And in fact, many of the birds that you get through Tractor Supply come from Hoover Hatchery, as well as a lot of other local farm stores. The local farm store that I order my chicks through, or I have been ordering my chicks through, they actually source their chicks from Hoover and from Cackle, both of which I have ordered direct from before in the past. So anyhow, what are we getting this year? Well, this year we're getting our standards, Buff Orpingtons, Delawares, Speckled Sussex, White Leghorns. So those are ones that we have just about every year in our flock now. This year, we're also going to get Welsumers again. We took a year off from Welsumers, and I really have missed their speckled eggs in the carton. And so we're bringing them back. We're going to do Cochins for the second year in a row. So we tried Cochins out last year for the first time, really liked them. And so we have an assortment of female Cochins on the way. And we are also returning to the flock, something that we've taken a break from for about 4 or 5 years, and that is Easter eggers. We kind of took a break from Easter eggers because we felt like they weren't as hardy and they got picked on by some of the other birds in our flock, but we wanted to give them another chance because this year we are also going to try Polish. Now, if you're not familiar with the Polish chickens, they're the ones with the funky little tufted tops or heads. They kind of have feathers on their heads. And we think that maybe the Easter eggers and the Polish together might be a good combination. We don't know. We're trying it out. We'll see whether or not that plays out well. But that's the list of breeds that we're getting this year. Buff Orpingtons, Delawares, Speckled Sussex, White Leghorns, Welsumers, Cochins, Easter Eggers, and Polish. This week, I also ordered our broiler chicks. Very excited about that. Now, unfortunately, I was a little late to the game, and because of that, I had to take a later delivery than I had wanted to. So the chicks are going to arrive a week later than normal for us, which means that my processing date, instead of being Memorial Day weekend, will be the first weekend in June, which isn't a huge deal. We can make it work. And hopefully it'll maybe even be a little warmer then. And so we'll see. But very excited about that. Ordered again through Valley Farms Hatchery. Went back to them this year. The hatchery I ordered from last year, the batch of chicks that I had and my dad had just weren't good. We experienced a lot more loss than we have in the past. And I don't know if it was the hatchery, if it was the year. We didn't change our methodology. So I don't know. But anyhow, I'm going back to my tried and true Valley Farms hatchery as the source of my broiler chicks. And we'll see if we do any better this time around. But very excited about that. Yesterday, I spent quite a bit of time doing some reorganization here in my office. If you're watching this on YouTube, right off to my right is where my seed starting system has traditionally been. And then last year, as you might recall, we had a bit of a problem with mold in our bedroom where we had to have some remediation done. And that forced us across the hall into our office for several months. And that meant that the seed starting system got moved out into our dining room area, where it has sat since then. And my wife is gracious and loving and patient and kind, and she would have let me keep it there again for the season. But I really wanted to get that mess, so to speak, out of her way. And so we've relocated it back here to the office. And hopefully this week, I will start a few things like herbs and onions. Still a little bit too early to start my peppers and tomatoes and things like that. I've got to resist the temptation to get a jump start on those things, unless I want to keep potting things on. And I don't like to do that. I'm a lazy gardener. So I try to put in as the minimal amount of effort needed to be successful in gardening. And so I just don't like potting things on if I can avoid it, which means I wait a little later to start some of those things. And in fact, I talked about that in this week's blog post. If you missed that, head on over to thehomesteadjourney.net/blog, where kind of tongue in cheek, I talk about the 5 things you should be doing on your homestead right now. In that blog post, I talk about how different locations mean different things should be happening on a homestead. And while I see a lot of people starting seeds that are in different grow zones, I have to resist the temptation to get started right now. And in fact, I talk about that also in this month's newsletter, the importance of resisting the temptation of getting out ahead of myself. But this month's newsletter really was focused on the idea of hope and how spring on the homestead really does bring a sense of hope. And I don't know about you guys, but when I turn on the news and I hear about the conflict in the Ukraine, I read about skyrocketing gas prices, skyrocketing food costs. I could use a little bit of hope in my life. And so I hope those of you who are subscribed to the newsletter were encouraged by me sharing my thoughts with regards to the hope that comes along with the homestead. If you're not currently a newsletter subscriber, if you head on over to thehomesteadjourney.net/newsletter, you can go ahead and get signed up, and you can still get a copy of this month's newsletter. And in that, not only did I have my thoughts about hope, but I shared some of the links to recent blog posts, recent podcast episodes, in case you might have missed some, as well as links to some of the recipes that I have been talking about here on the podcast. My wife actually made a delicious salmon, corn, and potato chowder this week. Now, the salmon didn't come from the homestead, but the corn and the potatoes certainly did. And it was delicious. And I've been talking about some of those recipes that we've been enjoying here on the homestead. And I have shared those links in the newsletter. But those who are members of the supporting listeners program already had access to those links because I do post them in the recipe channel over on the Discord server. So if you're not a member of all this stuff, you're missing out on a lot. Definitely go ahead and get signed up for the newsletter if you're not already signed up. A few other things that I did on the homestead this week. I got out and I pruned our grapes, and I also pruned our currants. And I'm going to be trying something that I've never tried before, and that is I am trying to propagate currants and grapes from the cuttings. And so I'm trying a couple of different methods. Actually, I'm going to be trying 3 different methods of doing so. I'm going to be just putting some right in the ground. I'm going to be putting some in what they call rooting hormone or rooting powder, and then putting it in some soil. And then I'm also going to be rooting some in some water. And I'm going to try to figure out which way works the best with grape cuttings and currant cuttings here on our homestead. But it's a really great way of us being able to perhaps grow more fruit on our homestead, or to have maybe a source of income where I can sell some of those cuttings onto other people, or maybe barter with other people, or maybe give them away. So it really does open up a lot of possibilities to use something that otherwise might just be discarded. And we're all about reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Repurpose things. And if I can take those cuttings and with a minimal amount of effort, if I can go ahead and get them to grow into additional plants, why not? And so we're going to give that a try. Have never tried this before. And so I will keep you updated as we kind of work through that process. I'll probably be including some notes on that in the newsletter or maybe in a blog post. So definitely you're going to want to check those things out. Get subscribed so that you're really able to stay up to speed with what we've got going on here on the homestead, as well as following our social media accounts. I do post fairly regularly on Instagram and Facebook. And so if you want to keep up to date with what we're doing here on the homestead and not just wait for a podcast episode, check us out on our social media accounts. Another thing that I did this weekend, like I said, it was a busy week here on the homestead, is I finally got around to putting together all of the receipts and all that kind of stuff for taxes. I haven't got my stuff to my tax guy yet. And part of that is because last year I did a really horrible job of staying on top of keeping records. And I did an entire episode on this, on the importance of keeping good records on the homestead. And then I failed to follow my own advice. And so I'm trying to do better this year than I did last year, and failing miserably. But that's a topic for another day. But I did get all of that stuff into a spreadsheet. I have a few more things to add, and then I'll be able to get that over to my tax guy this week. And that will be one less thing for me to worry about. Oh boy, I'm a libertarian, so to me, taxation is theft. But yeah, a lot of fun putting all that in this weekend. My eyes were a little cross-eyed, but we got it done. A couple of other things that I did want to share with you. First of all, I don't have all of the details yet, so I just want to leave it at this. But we have some very exciting plans in the works here in the Northeast. If you're somebody who lives in the Northeast part of the United States, or you're somebody who's interested in traveling to the Northeast part of the United States, go ahead and block out the weekend of September 10th and 11th. Okay. September 10th and 11th, block that out. I've got some exciting news to share about that, but you're definitely going to want to kind of be ready to make some plans, shall we say, for the weekend of the 10th and 11th of September, especially if you're in the northeastern part of the United States. Definitely save those dates. All right, that's it for this week's homestead happenings. Like I said, things are really starting to ramp up here on the homestead, and I anticipate they will continue to get crazier as we move on into the spring. Before we head on over to this week's Charting the Course, I did want to take a moment and remind you about the Supporting Listeners program. For as little as $3 a month, which I do like to remind you is less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks, you can support the show and also gain access to the private Discord server where there is an amazing group of people. We're interacting with one another, sharing successes, failures, joys, sorrows. It's just a great community of individuals, like-minded individuals, if you are pursuing self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. There's also a $5 a month and a $10 a month tier, each with additional perks. So if you are interested in supporting the show and becoming a member of the Supporting Listeners program, head on over to thehomesteadjourney.net/support for more information and to get signed up today. All right, let's jump on over to this week's Charting the Course. As I mentioned in the opening, this week I am joined once again by Jack Pollner from the Mindful Homestead YouTube channel. And really, Jack is somebody who is not a stranger to anybody who has listened to this podcast for any length of time. Jack is a good friend of mine. I've gotten to know him and Don Bradner from over at Little Mountain Life. I joke that I talk to those guys more than I talk to my own brothers. And that really is not a joke. It is really true. But Jack and his wife, Jackie, and their daughter, Emma, are homesteaders in southern New Hampshire. And they're on, I think, about 10 acres of land, doing a lot of great things. And one of the areas of expertise that Jack has is in the area of homestead maple production. And so I'm excited to chat with him about that. Really enjoyed this conversation, as I always do, and I hope you do as well. So with that said, Jack, welcome back to the show.
Hey, what's going on, Brian? I'm pretty sure, am I the most returning guest at this point?
So far,
I'm the closest thing to a co-host you've got right now.
Absolutely, but desperate times call for desperate measures.
Hey, you're dragging the bottom of the barrel here.
Glad to have you back on. And today we're going to be chatting about small scale maple production, homestead scale maple production, something that you've done for a couple of years. So let's just start with how you got into doing maple production.
So we're fairly small here on our homestead. We're just over 10 acres, and we live in kind of an area of New Hampshire that is known for maple production. The state in general is very proud of its maple production. Probably not as proud as Vermont, but we have every year in March, Maple Weekend, where there's an open house everywhere, and you can drive around to different sugar houses, and they do different events. And we do like maple bingo, essentially, where there's a scavenger hunt to go around and hit as many maple sugar houses as you can. And so it's kind of just ingrained in the culture of who we are. And when we bought our place, I noticed that there was a stand of maples near the house, not sugar maples, but red maples, which we can talk more about later, and the difference between the two. But I said, hey, this is kind of cool. Let's throw some taps in there and see what we get and boil it down. And the first year I did it, I literally boiled my sap down from 5 or 6 trees that were all within 50 feet of each other. And I used a gigantic spaghetti pasta pot that I had and just threw it on the stove and burned through probably half a house tank of propane trying to get that down into maple syrup. And that was it. At that point, we were hooked. It was kind of like, as hip as it sounds, it was very small batch maple syrup. All the trees were within 50 feet of each other. And it was cool. You could actually taste a difference, being that maple syrup was just from those trees versus, the blended that you get at the store, where even if it's from a specific sugar house, they might have thousands of taps that they're working with. So that was it. We got hooked right then and there.
So let's go back to the types of maple.
Mhm.
There are several different types. There's sugar maple, there's red maple, there's, I think, silver maple. I don't even know all the types of maple that there are. Kind of give me a
Yeah.
rundown of that.
So there are different types of sugar of not sugar trees, but maple trees. Um, and like you said, there's different varieties, and the sap that they put out is different. The sugar maples that are the most famous for tapping for maple syrup. Part of the reason why a lot of people want to tap them specifically for maple syrup is they're going to have the best ratio typically of sugar to water inside their sap. Um, from a sugar maple stand where you're using just sugar maples, you're going to be looking at making a gallon of maple syrup for every 40 gallons or so of sap that you collect from those trees. And a good tree can put out a gallon of sap a day. So your run, you're talking maybe you get 2 good weeks of running during the year. Each tree is going to give you maybe 14 gallons of sap. You're talking now from sugar maples, you can make a gallon of syrup for yourself realistically with 3 trees if you catch every drop and you boil it. Um, which is pretty good. I mean, a lot of people, if you have an acre of land, you may have 3 maple trees in your front yard. Once you start getting into red maples and rock maples and what some people call hard maple and swamp maples and all these other maples that are out there, they have a bunch of different regional names too. Like red maple and swamp maple, a lot of the time are the same tree, but people just call them different things. You're starting to get up into sugar concentrations where you're looking at more, 50 gallons to 1 gallon of syrup, and even 60 gallons to 1 gallon of syrup. Um, and that's just part of the game. I mean, you could tap all sorts of different trees, and this is something really at the end we can talk about too. But you can tap walnut, you can tap birch, and those trees get up into the hundreds of gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of that syrup. So sugar maples are definitely preferable, but we have all red maples here on the property, and that's what we tap. And even at the homestead level, we're able to get good syrup out of 50 or so gallons of syrup or 50 gallons of sap.
You're in the middle of doing some clearing of land there on your
Mhm.
on your property. Did you sacrifice any of your maples as part of that?
We did. Not really any that we were tapping. With tapping trees, especially on the homestead level and as small as we are, um, we had enough maples that were what I call easy access trees to utilize them to make our syrup for the year. So we were tapping stuff next to the driveway. We were tapping stuff that was alongside the yard, maybe within 20 feet of the edge of our yard where it turns into forest. So those were the trees that we were tapping mostly. When you're logging like we are, not to get too far into it, but each tree has a value that for the wood that it's able to give. And maples are one of those trees that, a good clean maple makes great saw boards for making lumber for furniture and decorative trim and things like that. And beyond that, even if it's a misfigured tree, it doesn't have very good straight trunk. Maple's a great firewood, and up in New England, we burn a lot of firewood to keep warm through the winter. We have a fire going downstairs right now. So you're talking about, even if it's an ugly tree and you can't cut it into boards, it's perfect for firewood. And that still is going to fetch $300 a cord when it comes out. So to offset the cost of the logging that we were doing, we did sacrifice some maples. Not as much maple as we did pine and hemlock, which aren't really useful for us in that regard. But it stung a little seeing some of those maples coming out of the woods and looking at them being like, oh, that was a big tree. I bet that makes a lot of sap in the spring.
Now, this time of the year is certainly when maple season really kicks into gear.
Mhm.
We have a lot of maple sugaring houses around us. We're kind of right on the edge of the Vermont border. And so maple production is a huge thing for a lot of my friends. And so this time of the year is really when that sap starts flowing. So just talk a little bit about the conditions that are optimal for maple sap to run.
Yeah. It's kind of one of the cool things about maple sugaring, and what really got me is that there's a lot of mystique to it. That you'll hear old timers talking about it, and it's not something you can judge on the calendar every year and say, oh, it's the second week of February, let's go tap the trees. It's very temperature dependent, it's very condition dependent. Those maples, they want snow on the ground, but they also want warm air temps. They want some sun poking out, they want enough daylight hitting their trunks. So really what you're looking for right around the middle of February at our latitude and longitude where both you and I are, mid-February is about when there's enough sun in the sky that can really start warming up those trunks and get that sap moving. You're looking for a temperature though. Also, you want, just above freezing during the day. 40 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. And then in the evenings, you want it to dip back below freezing, usually around 25. You don't want to get down to like 10 or below that, because then your trees will actually start sucking moisture back up into them from the taps. If you're running a line system, if you're using a bucket, it doesn't matter as much. But so really you want that sunlight hitting the trunks. You want it warm. The most sap that you're going to see typically is from taps that have been placed on the south side of the tree, which is going to get the most sunlight. But you'll also see when you get those temperatures that are kind of bouncing back and forth, above freezing, below freezing, above freezing, below freezing. The longer that goes on a stretch, the better the run you're going to get and the more sap those trees are going to put out. Once you start getting into situations where, you're not getting below freezing at night, the trees are going to start to bud out. And once they start, budding out, you're still going to get sap out of them, but it's going to have kind of an off taste to it. It'll be a little bit grassy when you boil it down. It's not the best quality for making sap or making syrup out of.
Now, usually the first sap produces the lighter grade syrup, right? And then
Yep.
as it goes on, it really becomes more, I'm going to use the term mapley. I don't know if that's a real word.
More
but
robust is
robust.
a term people like to use. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Robust. Quite frankly, I don't understand. A lot of people, they just love that. And what are they even calling it now? Because they've changed the grading system. It used to be like grade A, now it's
still grade A. Grade A, and then you have
amber. I don't know.
they have the grade A itself, and then they have the colors like light amber, dark amber. Really kind of it all, they have charts for that sort of thing. And it really only matters if you're selling it. On a homestead scale, if you're not going to be selling it, it doesn't really matter that much. What ends up happening with the whole color gradient is your first sap of the year has a higher sugar content in it. And that requires less boiling to get your sap into syrup. If you've got more sugar, you don't need to boil out as much water. And what ends up happening is you don't caramelize the sugars as much as you would later in the season when there's more water. So you get a very clean, a very light. I should have brought some up here with me. Maybe I'll run and grab a bottle in a little bit so we at least have a visual. But your early season sugar is going to be a much lighter, cleaner, because it hasn't been boiled as long. There's not as many impurities in there. If you're running over an open setup like we are, where, you're not necessarily venting your smoke all the way up and out of a sugar house, like my smokestack is, the chimney is, it dumps 6 feet above my pan. So inevitably, as weird as it sounds, you get a piece of, ash every now and again that floats back into the pan. In a well-controlled setup, you'll get a very clean tasting, crisp syrup from that. Over open stuff like we do, you get a little bit more of like a smoky flavor every now and again, which is cool. But really, you're just not boiling it as long, and you get a cleaner syrup because of it. That robust flavor, I mean, if you talk to an old school maple head, like, yeah, it's really cool to see that beautiful yellow golden syrup at the beginning of the year. But if you talk to like any old school maple guy, what's he putting on his pancakes? He's putting that robust stuff because it's got that strong flavor that people like. It's almost like it's kind of like a toasted mahogany vanilla type. I don't know. That's a nerdy thing to say, but it's got a flavor to it that's unmistakable when it's that darker stuff.
Yeah, and that's definitely my preference. I just love the dark stuff, the fancy, whatever they're calling it these days, the light stuff from the beginning of the season. It's not quite my preference, but to your point, when you're doing it the homestead scale, you get what you get. You don't pitch a fit.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I've got batch 1 from last year. That is that nice light color. It's kind of a point of pride for if you're boiling sap to kind of see how light and how clear you can get it. But at the end of the day, I've also got jars full of like dark, almost, looks like Coca-Cola. And that stuff's just as good on pancakes when you put it on there. You don't notice much of the difference.
I would argue it's probably better, but that's just me being biased.
Oh yeah.
So what equipment then really is needed at a home scale level. I mean, you certainly in maple production, if you ever go visit a maple,
Mhm.
somebody who's doing it for a living, they're going to have an entirely different system. They're going to have, I mean, they put vacuum hoses on there to
Yep.
suck the sap out of the tree, and they do reverse osmosis to take water content out. A lot of crazy stuff like that. We're not doing that at the home scale level. So
No.
for a homesteader, what do you need in order to gather sap?
So the one thing you're not going to get away from that you can't really kind of jerry rig is you're going to need taps. Um, Typically you're looking at taps where you drill a hole into a tree and you tap the tap in. And there's two ways you can go about it. You can do buckets which hang off the tree, or you can do what a lot of people do on the homestead level now, which is 5-gallon buckets. You can get 5-gallon buckets from a place like Tractor Supply or Home Depot, and just make sure it's food safe. And you can run a line from your tap down into that bucket and you can collect your sap that way. So depending how many trees you do, you're looking at a bucket per tree and a tap per tree. Some trees, if you have a tree that's over 12 inches or over a certain size, you can put multiple taps in trees. You just want to be mindful that you're not over tapping the tree, and you can find all those the bits and pieces to that online. So for your tapping, that's really all you need. You need the drill bit, your tap, and a couple buckets and some tubing to run. CDL, which is a company that sells maple equipment, they sell actually a beginner's kit, which will have all the pieces of hose and taps and things like that, which are great to get started with. I think it runs like $40 or something like that. It's not expensive at all. So that's on the tapping side of thing. That's collecting your sap. On the boiling side of things, you can get away going pretty cheaply. You can build a small, they call it an arch, is what the maple evaporator is essentially called in the circles. They say an arch. You can build a small arch out of cinder blocks and use stainless chafing dishes from like a hotel operation to boil your sap. You can Google that. Again, I hate telling people just, hey, go out on the internet, but on a podcast, I can't show you pictures of stuff necessarily. So if you go to Google and you punch in, or your favorite search engine, and just punch in cinder block maple arch, you'll find pictures of stuff that people have done and how to build it. And really, it's just a matter of lighting a fire under it. You need dry wood, obviously, but get your fire going, start boiling your sap down. And that's really, on the most basic sense of it, that's all you need. If you don't want to use that, you can use a turkey fryer. You can rig it up somehow. At its core, like I said, the first year I did it, I made probably 3/4 of a gallon of syrup using a pasta pot on my stove inside and running the fan at full tilt to get as much of that steam out as you can. Because if you have any wallpaper on the walls in your house and you start boiling sap, you're going to melt that wallpaper right off the walls. Makes a lot of steam. The humidity in your house goes way up.
The wife is not going to be happy if the wallpaper starts coming
Oh,
off
yeah.
coming off the
Well,
wall.
because think about it. Like if you're boiling, I mean, I probably had to boil that sap. I would boil it down and add more sap and boil it down and add more sap. And at the end of boiling 3/4 of a gallon of syrup off, I had burned through, I'd put probably close to 30 gallons of water into the atmosphere of my house. Now, think about walking into your kitchen and kicking over a 30-gallon trash can that's filled with water and just letting it evaporate over the course. You don't pick it up, you don't wipe it up, you just let it evaporate. That's essentially what you do when you boil inside. So if you can avoid it, I definitely say try to set up outside. The only caveat I'd have with that is if you're going to use a turkey fryer instead of a natural fire that you can kind of let burn down, just keep a close eye on it toward the end, because turkey fryer will scorch your sap pretty quick.
And then that basically, once it's scorched, it's done.
You're done. I mean, unless you like the flavor of burnt maple syrup or burnt sugar, which I don't know too many people who do.
No.
I mean, you could maybe find some use for it somehow. Maybe you could ferment it and make it into some sort of alcohol if that's what you're into. But by and large, once you scorch it, it's not good. And you're not getting it off the pan either. It's
not at all. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. When we were young, we were kids, my dad got into some small scale maple production. We didn't have any maple trees at our house, but we had some friends that had maple trees, and they would allow us to tap them. And so we would drive around periodically. We had the 5-gallon buckets, the hose and whatnot, and we would gather it, bring it home. And out on the back porch, we had an old gas stove,
Yep.
and my dad had, I believe it was an enamel wash pan. And he just put that over 2 burners, and he would just
Went
boil the
for it.
sap down in that.
Yep.
And so we made a lot of syrup that way until one day he fell asleep on the couch
Ooh.
and scorched the syrup, ruined the pan, and that was the end of
Yep.
our maple syrup production.
Yeah, that's it's once it's done, it's done.
Yeah,
There's no saving it.
definitely. So you definitely can do it, the doing the cinder block arch, but then last year you kind of took it to the next level, so to speak. So tell me a little bit about that, and I will link in the show notes to your video last year. I actually think you did a couple of videos.
I think it was a
So
3-part series. Yeah, we did.
yeah, on building this fancy evaporator.
Yeah, I got into it. So your next step up from kind of a cinder block arch and that sort of thing. For a while, I had an old wood stove that I cut the top off of and I was using for a couple of years and just setting, again, those stainless steel chafing pans on top of that instead of cinder blocks. Last year, I decided I was going to make what's called a barrel evaporator, kind of in the trade. And you essentially take a 55-gallon metal drum, you cut a hole in the front, turn it on its side and cut a hole in the front of it. And you put a barrel stove kit there, which is essentially a cast iron door. It has a spot on the top where you can put a stovepipe out of. And I cut the top off of it, welded up a frame that sat on top to hold a more expensive than I'd like to admit stainless steel pan made specifically for maple sugaring. And that's how I'm doing it now. You line it with some bricks so that you get the fire right up in the front of the barrel. It goes up and back. And again, you can see all this in the videos. And you boil your sap that way. And the cool thing about the pan that I'm using now is it's what's called a divided pan. It has a pre-warmer on top. So you put your sap in the pre-warmer, it warms it up, and then it drops into a pan that kind of has a pathway that snakes around. And you actually end up, because you're continuously adding sap that hasn't been boiled off yet to one end, it follows that snake, and by the end of the snake you have finished syrup at the end, and intermittently you can draw off your syrup into jars, mason jars and things like that, and you don't need to do as much finishing when you bring it inside on the stove.
Mm-hmm. So definitely a huge step up from what you had been doing, but as you mentioned, certainly there's a cost component to it as well.
There is, and it's not as crazy as a lot of other things on the homestead. Like, you can definitely get way more into the weeds with other stuff. If you're handy with an angle grinder and you know how to weld, or you have somebody that can weld cheap for you, I would say that evaporator, and I made the comment about, the pan being expensive, but at the end of the day, it was made up locally by somebody who specialized in that sort of thing. I have less than probably $600 into the whole setup, I would say, would be my guess.
Nice. But $600 plus you figure the amount of time and so on and so forth. You certainly have to make a lot of syrup to kind of get any kind of payback for it. And that's one of the things that you and I were talking about before we started recording, is that it's certainly one of those things that on a small scale, you just have to admit that you can buy it cheaper. So you're doing it for the love of it. You're doing it because you want that sense of self-reliance, and you have the skill. But if people decide, hey, I'm going to tap maple trees and get into this at a small scale level to save money, it's probably not going to happen.
No, it's the way the whole thing works is again, it harkens all the way back to the very beginning of the podcast where I talked about we have that maple culture here in New England. Some of my favorite days, especially with Emma, my daughter, have been hanging out outside. I mean, we're completely open air. Like, some people have sugar shacks. We're open air. That I set the evaporator up in the driveway, and that's where we boil. Some of my favorite days have been hanging out outside. I'll put some Willie Nelson on or something, and we're hanging out in the spring air boiling maple syrup. There's a price that you can't put a price on that sort of thing, but you can put a price on buying syrup from the store, and you're talking, a gallon of syrup at the retail level is going to cost you maybe $60. If the average family goes through a gallon of syrup a year, $60 a year versus the 10 years or so that this maple evaporator's got in it, you're never going to come out on top, especially when you factor in your time. So, so this year, to kind of get out what we were talking about, we were having that logging done on the property that Brian talked about. And to do that, I had to pull my lines down so that the machines could get around without ruining that. And when they wrapped up logging last week, we're probably already about halfway through our sugaring season here in New Hampshire, at least in my region. And I kind of looked at it, and I looked at what I had left over from last year still in the basement. And I said, forget it. I'm not putting the lines back up. It's not worth, I've got a lot of other stuff going on. If we need syrup come next January or February, when we start running low, I'll go to the store and I'll buy a jug, or I'll find another, maple syrup purveyor locally, somebody else doing it, and pick up a quart from them. But at the homestead level, it's just not something that, you're doing because you're trying to save money. Even, I mean, we raise pigs, you raise pigs. A lot of your listeners probably raise pigs or raise pastured poultry for meat. You're not going to touch 89-cent, chicken breast at the store. You're not going to touch $1.99 pork chops at the store doing it yourself. Our per pound price on pork this year, when I did the numbers, was not anywhere close to what I would consider affordable. Even with us selling, the fact that we sell it is what offsets that cost for us and makes it affordable. But if you're just doing it and putting in all the work yourself, especially if you're factoring in, the time associated with it, I mean, I would have to pay for my pork operation to be profitable. I would have to pay myself like $1.50 an hour if I was actually factoring in paying myself an hourly wage. And maple syrup, it's the same. I mean, to make a gallon of maple syrup, you're going to stand around, unless you have a $5,000, plus maple arch. You're going to be standing around all day to boil a gallon of sap. And, figure 8 hours at $5 an hour. That's, $40. Just buy the maple syrup at that point. Buy a gallon of syrup.
Well, and the other piece to it as well is a lot of people have a tendency as they're boiling syrup to sit around and enjoy some of the fruits of the vine, shall we say?
Yep.
And so
there's all sorts of tradition there. Some people have drinks, some people boil. They'll take off like a gallon of sap, not a gallon of syrup, but a gallon of sap, and they'll boil hot dogs in it. Like, there's costs associated with just hanging out and doing it.
Absolutely. So all of that adds up. But at the end of the day, it is there is that sense of satisfaction. And as you mentioned, the memories that you've made with Emma are ones that you cannot put a price tag on. And so all of that needs to be factored into it. But simply looking at it from the standpoint of small scale production, I'm going to do it to save money or even make a little money on the side. Just to be frank, that's probably not going to happen at the small scale level. That's not to say that to discourage anybody, but it's just trying to keep it real.
Yeah, I think it's the same with any homestead endeavor. I mean, show me a person that can grow a carrot, and not counting if they sell vegetables at a farm stand, but show me a person that can grow a garden full of vegetables for less than they could go to the store and buy those same vegetables. And I'll show you the person that should be the most selling garden author on the face of the planet, because I can't think of anything I do on the homestead that I couldn't just go to the store and buy it cheaper at some point. Assuming, you can go to the store and buy it, I don't know of any grocery stores that sell forest pastured pork in my area particularly, but if you're just comparing apples to apples, if you need food to eat and survive, you can't do it. We're doing homesteading for a reason. And this is getting, way into the homesteading philosophy aspect, but there's a lot of things that we do just because we want to do them and we have fun and we enjoy doing them. To look at the end of the day, like if I make, some waffles, or if I make maple breakfast sausage, I can look at it and say that maple syrup and that pig came from me, or that maple syrup on those pancakes that my daughter's eating. I used flour, not necessarily that I made, but I made the pancake mix from scratch. I made the maple syrup from scratch. I didn't churn the butter because I'm not milking anything and I don't feel like making my own butter, but I'm not going down that route. See, there's, again, certain things I just won't do as a homesteader. I'm not into milking. I don't want to get up early. I don't want to be in the barn late. Yeah. And I'm lactose intolerant, so it's no good for me anyway.
Right. But, the fact is there is that sense of satisfaction that you do get from doing it yourself. And the other piece to it as well is, I tell people all the time, for me, it's as important of knowing what's not in my food as
Yep.
what is in my food. So I know how those animals were raised. I know, how that sap was, that syrup is really 100%. Not to say that people in New England that are selling, real maple syrup are doing anything but selling real maple syrup.
Yep.
But, if you go buy Log Cabin or well, it's not Aunt Jemima anymore because that's not politically correct.
You can't use it. Yeah, you can't say that.
Yeah, whatever.
But you're not getting like the sugar adulterated stuff that you can
Yeah.
buy in the stores. Yeah.
No, not at all. And so again, whether it's maple syrup, pork, whatever. Again, we know what's not in it, and that sense of satisfaction, and also having that skill. This week, we've seen some things that I don't think we thought we'd ever see again in our lifetime with regards to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia.
Yep.
And, there's just a lot of crazy stuff going on in our world. And so if the proverbial crap hits the fan, well, you know how to make maple syrup at least.
Yep. And I think it's something that everyone should at least try it. If you go out and you collect a gallon of sap and you throw it in a pan on your stove and you boil it down over the course of a couple hours and you make, I think a gallon of sap will make just under like 4 ounces, I think is the actual conversion. It'll make like 4 ounces of maple syrup. So like 4 shot glasses of maple syrup, enough for pancakes, for a couple people for the morning. That's something I think a lot of people should do, because not only will you know how to do it, you've done it, but it puts in your head that the work behind what's actually done. So many people say maple syrup, $60 a gallon. What's up with that? But then as soon as you go out and make it and how the work that goes into it, and somebody had to tap that tree, somebody had to wait for that tree to drop the sap into the bucket, somebody had to carry that bucket back to an evaporator. It gives you a newfound appreciation of what's going on around you. And I think that's what we need in today's world, because like you said, you can go buy Log Cabin or any of the other brands out there that are just essentially corn syrup coloring and flavoring. And one, it's not healthy, but two, it's taking the skill out of maple syrup and taking these people that are what I would consider craftsmen. Not even myself, I'm not even that good at it, but it's taking the craftsmen and the work and the knowledge that a lot of people possess, and it's essentially putting it back on the shelf and saying, I'll take this one instead for half the price, which could be made in a factory by a robot. It's you're preserving that knowledge and preserving that technique for other generations to come.
Absolutely.
Not everybody's got Google. Not everybody's going to be able to look up Google, say, oh, this is how you make maple syrup, and then make a gallon of it. There's a level of work that goes well beyond that.
Yeah, it definitely goes back to that idea of value, the understanding the true value of food, and where we have so turned it into a commodity now.
Yep.
Where when you have some blood, sweat, and tears invested in something, you appreciate it far more than just going down and buying it at the store.
I mean, at the risk of going super long with the podcast, I made a lot of sausage this year. This is the first time I ever took all of my trim back from the butcher. I didn't have him grind it up into sausage. And I said I was going to make all of the sausage for our family for the year by myself. It was close to, I think I had 85 pounds of trim between the two pigs. Let me tell you, people think sausage is like, oh, the junk meat, the sausage, this and that. It's hard to make, it's easy to make. All the crap just gets thrown into sausage. I spent more time in my kitchen late night grinding sausage, mixing in spices, mixing in binders, rehydrating sausage casings, stuffing sausage casings. It has been the most eye-awakening purpose for me that, no longer if I go into a classy butcher shop and see like handmade sausages from that butcher shop sitting in the case, will I look at it and be like, $10 a pound? What is that? That's sausage. That's garbage meat. I can get it for, $3 a pound at the grocery store. It opens your eyes, even to somebody like me that's been involved in this process now for years. It clarifies it and says, wow, that really, there's a lot of work that goes into sausage. And the fact that your butcher shop will do it for $2 a pound when you drop off a pig, it made me realize how hard my butcher's work that I've been dealing with. It's
yeah,
that's it. That's all I can say.
No, it's a great point. And so when a lot of times people look at, okay, you buy a pig from a small producer like you or I, and then depending on how you sell it, if you're selling it by the pound, and then charging processing fees on top of it, and then people
Mhm.
look at that and they say, well, that's just really ridiculous. But when you understand the work that goes into breaking an animal down and
Yep.
processing and the end cuts and all of the stuff that comes out of it, it's eye opening, and definitely there's an appreciation that you gain when you do it yourself.
Yeah. And that's
Um,
across the board, from people who
mhm,
garden to people who raise animals to people who make maple syrup. It's
mhm,
I think a lot of us get into the small farm and homesteading thing and you don't necessarily realize just the man hours involved in making stuff.
mhm.
Um, which is
Yeah.
why, again, like, it stems back to, I didn't have a lot of time this spring. I had a lot of other stuff going on. Maple syrup kind of got put on the back burner this year, but I'm still going to go to somebody who knows the craft and knows how to do it, and purchase it that way, or preferably barter. Maybe I'll barter some sausage.
You never know. And,
Yep.
and the other thing too, that I just definitely wanted to point out is this year you're taking the year off
Yep.
for a lot of reasons. You've decided that you're not going to do maple syrup this year, and that's okay. I think that's one of the big traps that homesteaders fall into, that they think that they have to do all the things every
Mhm.
year. Just because you did meat birds one year doesn't mean you need to do meat birds every year. It may mean that you never do meat birds again. um there are cycles, life happens, and so I think giving yourself grace to operate within that, I think, is all a part of being a sane homesteader.
Yep. And I think it takes a lot of chutzpah, if you will, to recognize that. Like, I have a majorly crazy spring going on with all this. Just real quick on the whole logging project, we're turning 3 acres of our land into pasture, to turn it from forest into pasture so we can graze animals on that in the future, ruminants that are going to eat grass. I have a lot of work out ahead of me this spring and summer to get that ready. Um, my spring batch of meat birds is only 40 birds, where we normally do 60 plus. I'm only doing 40 this year. And I know that doesn't sound like a big debt, like a big change, but try processing 20 birds by yourself on processing day.
Mhm.
That 20 birds by yourself is a full day.
Mhm.
You can maybe do more if you're really, really experienced and fast. But for me, by myself, I'm maybe 30 birds if I put in a full day.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm doing a light batch of meat birds this year.
Mhm.
And that just means I sell less and I put more in my own freezer.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people get sucked into the homesteading versus small farming debate, which is not anywhere I want to go. But if I was farming first, I would be looking at that and saying, well, how can I increase my productivity there? With homesteading, I look at it and say, hey, I've got a lot of other stuff I need to do. I'm going to scale this back a little bit. It's do what you can, do what you want. Um, Not that I would encourage it, but we are lucky enough in the world we're in right this moment that you can go to the grocery store and get a chicken if you don't do meat birds this year,
Mhm.
and that's something you want. Or there's probably another farmer locally to you that you can also get it from.
Yeah, 100%. And I just think that, again, having that, you guys talk about mindfulness, thus
We try to.
the name of your homestead, but just being mindful of, kind of your limitations, what you can handle, what you need. That there are sometimes, again, life happens,
Yep.
and that you're just okay with that. So this year, that evaporator, it's not going to get used, and it's all good. It's not going to fall apart on you.
No, and part of building in all this pasture is I'm building a sugar house, talking of projects, and it's getting put inside of a sugar house. So I'm not going to be standing in the pouring rain anymore if it starts raining, trying to figure out how I'm going to cover my maple pan. Because again, you're boiling water off. If it's raining, you're adding water to, you're going to sit there for 12 hours and be like, why is nothing
What did
happening?
I?
Yeah, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, part of building in our pastures, we have a small infrastructure. Well, I guess I'll let cat out of the bag here, I guess, a little bit. We have a large infrastructure thing going on. We're building a barn. We're going to build a greenhouse. We're building a smallish, I say small, but it's going to be approximately 10 by 14, a 10 by 14 sugar house that's going to house the evaporator and essentially be a little bit of a man cave for me to kind of get away. But that's the sort of thing, like, I'm not even maple sugaring this year, but I've still got projects to do to support that because it's something I like to do. Do I have to do it? No. Is it making me any money? No. From a farming aspect, maple sugaring is probably the least profitable thing that I do on the farm. But it's something I like, and it's something I'm putting time into, and I'm mindful of that and pushing on with it.
Well, before we go, one other project that you have underway, you just announced today on your vlog another project that you're doing. So tell us a little bit about that.
I guess I could, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see right there. It might be backwards. Is it backwards?
No, it's
all right. Cool.
Looking
Apple's
good.
Fix that up. It's not backwards anymore. We have, and for those of you that can't see it, we launched today a line, I guess you'll call it. It sounds designerish to say that, but a line of self-care products that we're calling the Dapper Pig by the Mindful Homestead. In a nutshell, basically, we had a fun little thing happen this year where not a lot of our pork customers wanted their lard. So we ended up with a surplus of lard in our freezer, and we can only cook with so much of it. I mean, I can't just cook up lard for dinner every night and say, here you go, we're eating lard tonight, lard soup. All sorts of digestive problems will ensue. So we were trying to figure out ways to get rid of it. And when I was at Homesteaders of America back in October, I ran into a small farm down in Maryland called Rootbound Farms. I plugged him in the video. I'll plug him here. And he was making soap and selling soap. They were using coconut oil. And I thought, this is pretty cool. I could probably make soap out of lard, and come to find out, lard soap is actually a very luxurious, popular thing.
Very.
And here I was with close to 150 pounds of lard in my freezer. So we started making batches of soap and testing different recipes and running all over the place with it, and launched it today. We've got 4 scents of soap up now. We've got 3 scents of beard balm. Again, if you're not on YouTube, you can't see my glorious beard here, but
it is glorious.
It's pretty good, if I do say so myself. I've been hanging on to this thing for a while, but I've been making my own beard balm and beard oil for a couple years and using it myself. So I decided to kind of introduce them into the line as well, because it made sense. Soap, beard balm, beard oil. And then we also have a hand salve in there as well, which is actually what I've got in front of me, which is infused with rosemary essential oil. It's got some olive oil in there, mango butter, beeswax. So, and this has lard in it as well, the hand salve, which is kind of weird. People don't like to be rubbing lard all over their hands, but it's a small amount, and with all the other ingredients, it works really well.
Nice.
But we launched that today. It's available on our website, mindfulhomestead.com. You can check it out. There are some things that have sold out already, which I'm going to be hustling. Again, speaking of tons of things to do, I'm going to be hustling to make some more soap and get, that's a process I can't rush. That needs, at least 3 weeks, 4 weeks to cure. But yeah, we're pretty psyched about that. It's
Excellent.
been good.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. So the mindfulhomestead.com, they can also find you on YouTube, Mindful Homestead, basically the Mindful Homestead everywhere. Instagram.
Just go to
YouTube.
Google, punch in the Mindful Homestead. All of our stuff will pop up. It's the easiest way for you to do it.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Jack, for hanging out with me. Great chatting with you as always. And we need to do this again sometime.
Definitely. You need a co-host, Brian. Come on. You need someone to rein you in every now and again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We'll do it again sometime.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jack. If you have any other questions, things that maybe I didn't cover on that, definitely head on over to Jack's YouTube channel. I will have links to his 3-part series, I believe it was, on homestead maple production in the show notes. So check those out and then ask him questions in the comment section. He is great at responding, and he'll be more than happy to help you out. Links to their YouTube channel as well as their website are in the show notes. Thanks once again, Jack, for joining me here on the Homestead Journey podcast. I really appreciate it. Folks, that's it for this week. If you have any questions, you'd like to reach out to me, I can be reached via email, brian@thehomesteadjourney.net. And until next time, everybody, keep up the good work.